Pizza majstori, u
Pizza
ovoj lekciji
masters,
radimo...
we're going to do some hand kneading at 3 different hydration levels to see the difference in the dough we obtain. We will work with a hydration of 65%, 75%, and 80%. We're using a weaker flour with 11% protein. You can use weaker flour when working with lower hydration levels like this. It doesn't have to be super strong. Once we've sifted the flour, the next step is measuring the water. Since we're making dough with 65% hydration, we need 650 grams of water. After measuring the water, we'll measure the salt. We need 25 grams of salt for 1 kilogram of flour. We're making a batch with 1 kilogram of flour. Next, we'll measure the olive oil. We need 20 grams. Lastly, we'll measure the yeast. 3 grams for 1 kilo of flour. That's it. We'll start by spreading the flour to the edges to make a well in the center. Then add the yeast. Crumble it a bit. And start pouring in a little water. We'll mix the yeast with the water. Then slowly start adding the flour. After that, we'll gradually add more water. It's important not to pour too much water at once, just a little at a time, similar to how you'd mix dough in a mixer. As we said, we're using weaker flour with 11% protein, which should absorb 65% water just fine. We'll use the same process for 75% and 80% hydration. When deciding on hydration levels, first we need to consider what kind of flour we have. If the flour has 10-11% protein, I recommend working with around 65-70% hydration levels. If we have stronger flour with 13-14% protein, we can go for higher hydration levels of 75%, 80%, or even more. The higher the hydration, the better and lighter the dough is. It's easier on the stomach compared to dough with lower hydration. However, if we use weaker flour and try to go for high hydration, the dough balls will reach their peak much faster, but they'll also stay at the peak much shorter. That's why we use strong flour for long fermentation and high hydration. Now we'll add the salt and the remaining water. Salt should always be added near the end, so it doesn't slow down the yeast or ruin the gluten structure. Now we start kneading the dough by hand. For this 65% hydration dough, we can finish kneading it by hand, but for 75% or 80% hydration, we'll need to use a wooden spoon because the dough would be too sticky to handle by hand. Pull and push, then turn it, pull, push. turn, and repeat. My advice is always to start with 65% hydration and gradually work your way up as you get more comfortable. Now we'll put the dough back into the bowl. Pour some oil and continue mixing. We've put the dough in the bowl to avoid oil spilling all over the table. Once the dough has absorbed some of the oil, we can take it out again and continue kneading. Just a little more, and the dough will be ready. Now we'll form the dough into a ball like this. Cover it with plastic wrap and let it rest for 15 minutes at room temperature. After 15 minutes of fermenting at room temperature, we'll start stretching and folding. First, oil the container where we'll place the dough. We'll put a little oil on the work surface and spread it with our hands. Then, we'll remove the plastic wrap from the bowl and take the dough out. Oil your hands a bit and start stretching and folding. Stretch the dough, fold it from all sides. Turn the dough over, stretch, and quickly fold it again. Move quickly to keep the dough from sticking to our hands. Stretch it, and fold it like this. Then tighten it into a ball. Now our 65% hydration Neapolitan pizza dough is ready. One important thing is to make sure the gluten doesn't tear. When tightening the dough, it should stay smooth without ripping. Now we'll transfer the dough to a bowl, cover it, and leave it at room temperature for about 60 minutes. After that, we'll put it in the fridge for cold fermentation. We have 3 hand-mixed doughs with different hydrations, 65%, 75%, and 80%. The process is similar, but the flour we use and the final result vary. Why? Because the amount of water in the dough directly affects the quality and flavor of the final product. The lower the hydration, the more bread-like the dough is. It feels heavier on the stomach. Higher hydration makes the dough more airy and easier to eat. The most important thing to remember is to match the strength of the flour to the hydration level we want. So, for 75% and 80% hydration, we'll use flour with 14% protein content. We'll place the flour around the edges of the bowl, making a little well in the middle. Then we add 3 grams of yeast, Crumble it up a bit, and pour in some cold water. Start mixing with a wooden spoon. Once the water and yeast are combined, we'll gradually add the flour from the sides and keep mixing. After the dough absorbs the water, we'll add more and continue mixing. We'll keep adding a little water at a time until the dough absorbs it all. Hand kneading this dough is really tough and takes a long time because of the high hydration. A lot of professional pizza chefs don't dare to work with 80% hydration. We add the yeast at the beginning, but salt comes at the end. Salt slows down fermentation and can damage the gluten, which we're trying to develop as much as possible right now. So we add the salt as late as we can. It takes quite a bit of effort to knead this dough, and the whole process is pretty lengthy. But the result is fantastic. You end up with a dough that's light, airy, and doesn't sit heavy in your stomach when you eat it. See how the dough starts bouncing around? It means there's air in it. We keep adding water little by little. Now there's a big difference between kneading dough in the summer and winter. It's not just summer and winter. There's a noticeable difference in spring and fall, too. Throughout the year, we have to adjust the recipe several times. For example, in the summer, we use much less yeast. When it's really warm, we might only use 2 grams of fresh yeast or even less per kilogram of flour. For dry yeast, we go even lower, using about 0.3–0.4 grams in the summer. In winter, we use around 4 grams of fresh yeast per kilogram, and 1 to 1.5 grams of dry yeast. Generally, we use about 1/3 of dry yeast compared to fresh. The quality of yeast also varies by brand. Some yeasts are faster, while others are slower. It's important to find a yeast that works best for our needs, which comes through trial and error as we test the available options. Temperature control is another important aspect of successful fermentation, especially when fermenting in the summer. The dough needs to go in the fridge sooner in hot weather. Don't wait until the dough has risen too much. Remember, the fridge takes time to cool it down from room temperature, and you don't want it to over-ferment. A tip I recommend is to let the dough ferment in smaller batches. Let's say you have 100 kilograms of dough. It's better to divide it into smaller portions because the fridge will cool them down faster. If you leave it all in one large pile, the yeast will keep working more actively in the middle of the dough, where the cold air hasn't reached yet, leading to uneven fermentation. Now we've reached the point where we'll add the salt, and then the remaining water. Check the temperature. It's 19.3 degrees Celsius. This is the ideal temperature. Just like when preparing with a mixer, always monitor the dough's temperature. Finally, add the olive oil. Once the dough has absorbed the olive oil, we'll let it rest for about 15-20 minutes before giving it stretch and fold. After 15 minutes, our dough is ready for stretching and folding. First, we'll oil the bowl using olive oil. We also put a little olive oil on the work surface. Now we take the dough out of the bowl and oil our hands a bit because the dough is still soft and sticky due to the high hydration. We stretch it like this and fold. Stretch and fold. We do this on all 4 sides. Then we flip the dough over, grab it like this, stretch it out, and fold it again. We'll repeat this process 1 or 2 more times. Afterward, we shape it into a ball. Once we've done the stretching and folding, we move the dough into an oiled bowl and let it rest for another 15 minutes. Cover the bowl with plastic wrap to keep the dough from drying. After 15 minutes, it's time for the second round of stretching and folding. We put more olive oil on the work surface and repeat the process. Then, we let it rest for another 15 minutes of fermentation. Next, we oil a plastic container thoroughly, making sure to coat all sides. This is important so that after 24 hours of fermentation, the dough will easily come out when we flip it onto the flour. Place the dough into the bowl and leave it for a 60-minute fermentation at room temperature. Now, we're putting our Neapolitan pizza dough into the fridge for a cold fermentation, where it will rest for the next 20 to 24 hours. The most important is to pay attention to the dough during fermentation and understand what's telling us. Dough is alive, and every day it behaves a little differently. Even if the flour is just 1 degree colder, the reaction of the dough will be different. After cold fermentation, we'll ball up the dough. Dust the work surface with flour. Semolina or all-purpose flour will work fine. We're going to flip this bowl over like this. It's best to let the dough fall out without pulling it with your hands. That way, we don't mess up its structure. Next, we'll place some flour on the scale and cut dough balls of around 300 grams each, enough for a 32 centimeter pizza. Flip one side, then the other, then roll it up, and close it. If the dough sticks to your hands, lightly flour your palms like this. The dough won't stick to your hands anymore. With high hydration dough like this, it tends to be sticky. See, if you leave your hand on the dough too long, it sticks. That's why you need to move quickly when handling dough with high hydration. We drop the dough ball onto the work surface. Take a little flour. Just a small amount is enough. We're not pouring flour all over. We're just lightly dusting our hands. Then, we tighten the dough ball a little more. It's important that the seam, the part we closed, faces down. From 1 kilogram of flour, we've made a total of 6 dough balls. And the gluten mustn't tear during this process. The gluten skin keeps in the gases produced by the yeast. So the dough ball should be smooth and nice. Cover the bowl and leave the dough at room temperature for 30 to 60 minutes. The exact time depends on the room temperature. We don't want it to over-ferment, but we also don't want to put it in the fridge too early and stop the fermentation. We need to monitor the dough closely. Once it starts to come to life and rise, that's the moment we put it in the fridge for cold fermentation. For a minimum of 5 to 6 hours, but it can stay up to 24 hours. Now we're ready to make some pizza.